I want to begin by thanking, Paul and the New Canaan Parent Support Group for their commitment to supporting families um, affected by substance use and addiction. One of the most important things or messages any parent can really hear is, you are not alone. And families facing addiction often spend years trying to help, protect, rescue, persuade, monitor, um, or make sense of what's happening in their family. And these responses are understandable. They emerge from love, fear, and a deep desire to help. So tonight we're going to explore how chronic anxiety, which is associated with addiction, shapes family relationships, the roles that family members often find themselves in, um, and how recovery can shift um, from reactivity into thoughtful, intentional functioning. So my main message to you tonight is the goal is not to stop loving. The goal is to learn how to love without being governed by fear.
Hmm.
Um, so it's often said that addiction is a family disease. And tonight, I'm going to run through some slides with you to really understand what are the mechanics under that, why we say that. Um, and I'm going to talk a bit about acute and chronic anxiety and the ways that families adapt to that. Um, and then we're going to move into talking about communication patterns that have been studied um, that again come from a place of love, but have shown to be less helpful for people's recovery. And that's called a theory of expressed emotion. We'll get into those kind of communication styles. And and then I'm going to give you some suggestions. And like a lot of suggestions and advice, it's easier said than done, um, but it's doable. And, I hope you'll find this helpful. So one of the pioneers of family therapy is a guy named Murray Bowen. And he started looking at families as an entire system, not just, isolated individuals, kind of you know, in a group, but really as systems. And he said families are emotional systems, meaning that an emotion can spread through the entire family. That's one of his big ideas, that the parts and the whole are interacting all the time. So the idea is that one small part can affect the whole, and the whole is affecting the different parts of the system. What's hopeful about that is that often a little change in one part of the system can send ripple effects through the entire system. And that'll be important when we talk about how you can respond to addiction and chronic anxiety, and how that can have a beneficial effect to the whole family system. The other thing Bowen talked about was what he called intergenerational transmission processes. And what that means is when he would do genograms with families, which is sort of like doing a family tree that could go multiple generations back, he noticed reoccurring patterns. So he could see that, in two generations, there were several cutoffs. And what we mean by cutoffs is essentially people stopped talking to each other. Or he noticed that, certain symptoms might appear across generations. And really the idea is it doesn't begin with us. And, the unfinished business of our parents got passed down to us. Mm-hmm. And if we don't do our work, our unfinished business will be passed down to our kids, and so on. And there's always going to be something that's going to be passed down. We're not perfect beings, but unprocessed trauma, grief, all of those things can be transmitted pretty easily to our children because they're ensconced within the system. The other thing Murray Bowen talked about was the role of anxiety in family systems. And we're going to talk about the difference between acute anxiety and chronic anxiety. And what he noticed is that families will begin to organize around the management of anxiety. And that anxiety can spread very quickly. It's not just something that exists within someone, it exists between people. So I often compare anxiety in family systems like the hot potato. One person gets very anxious and they talk to another family member, they're like, you take it. And no, you take it, or it'll get passed on to someone else. And again, this is the idea that it's operating as a system. So where does anxiety come from in family systems? So part of our evolution is that we evolved in large or multi-family groups or tribes. And increasingly, our tribe gets smaller and smaller to now that we have nuclear families. Not that long ago, it was not unusual for people to be living with their parents and grandparents. And in some ways, that larger family systems helped us endure kind of the vicissitudes, the up and downs of life. So now mainly we have this nuclear family, and part of its job is protection. And anxiety comes from real or perceived threats to the family stability, one's sense of safety, to the sense of togetherness or connection, and the family's view of the future. Okay, so I talked about real or perceived. That's an important piece to keep in mind because sometimes our anxiety is response to an objective event, right? So someone gets laid off from their job unexpectedly. Someone is diagnosed with a medical issue. A child gets arrested. These are objective events that generate anxiety, and then we can respond to those. Chronic anxiety is a little bit different because now we're not just we're reacting to the possibility of bad things happening. So it might be, my child has been in treatment. They've been, as far as I know, sober for a period of time. And yet I'm constantly worried that they're going to relapse. Okay, we would call that a perceived threat because it isn't here yet. It's imagined. And one of our responses when there's been a lot of uncertainty and fear in a family is we start trying to predict. When's the bad thing going to happen? So and addiction is really what we call creates chronic anxiety in families because typically people for a long period of time are living in kind of a sustained period of where their nervous system is constantly activated. Right. So the experience of walking on eggshells around someone, that's an example of chronic anxiety. Parents continually monitoring an adult child in recovery. That's an example of chronic anxiety. Constantly checking, advising, surveilling, controlling because something bad could happen. That's an indication of chronic anxiety. And again, these all emerge because people are trying to anticipate when something bad could occur. Right, so it makes sense. There are attempts to manage, a parent who can't relax unless they know exactly where their adult child is and what they're doing. That's an example of chronic anxiety. Or I know she's doing well, he's doing well, but I can't stop worrying. I'm preoccupied. Those are manifestations of kind of chronic anxiety in a family system. So most families can adapt well to a kind of acute crises um, and um, and manage those. When you have chronic anxiety, we start seeing now kind of a restructuring of relationships and certain kind of communication styles. Um, so here are some of the things that we start seeing. Um, Again, this is an attempt to manage um, uncertainty and fear. So people have probably heard these. Kind of the survival rules in families with addiction. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Um, Again, these are all attempts to if I feel emotionally numb and shut down, which actually occurs when our nervous system is so activated and we're constantly in a state of alarm or hypervigilance, we will in time alternate between this kind of numbness and shutdown because our nervous systems weren't designed to be activated as if we're in imminent danger. You know, that part of our brain was really supposed to last about, that state was supposed to last about 20 seconds. Enough when that system, our brain system evolved when we were prey, not predators. So that 20 seconds was enough for us to either fight a predator, run, or freeze, which is a version of playing dead. So when you're in a chronic state of these fight, flight, freeze responses, the nervous system starts becoming accustomed to it. So I've often had families say to me, there's no crisis, but their bodies are saying, okay, but can't relax. I'm waiting for it to happen. And that's an example of a nervous system that's somewhat been conditioned to be in this state of alarm. Right? So often families isolate. Right. So one of the missions of the New Canaan Parent Support Group was really to say to people, the isolation will harm you. It's the worst thing that you can do. And yet our impulse when there's addiction in the family is to want to withdraw and get tighter, kind of circle the wagons. So just as in some ways the person with the addiction becomes more and more isolated, so can the family system. And that's why it's so important to be able to have groups like this and other kinds of groups like Al-Anon, so that one, people don't feel so alone. And the other benefit of groups like this is that there are some circumstances that aren't soluble. There are some situations that aren't solvable, that we have to bear. And there's an expression that when we can no longer change a circumstance, we're forced to change ourselves. And sometimes it's not so much about doing something, but having a group of people who can help us bear our fear and discomfort. And what I know is that two can bear it more easily than one, four more easily than two, and so on. And that's really the power of group work. So we have this concept in Bowen family systems called overfunctioning. And again, I'm going to explain how this kind of emerges. So when we see one of our family members struggling, and again, this could be related to addiction, it could be a mental health issue, it could be a physical health issue. Someone will start stepping in to do more for that person. And the more that person overdoes, it creates a reciprocal relationship where the less the other person has to do. Right? So the more I function on your behalf, the less you have to function, the less you have to be responsible. And so overfunctioning, the way I look at it, is it's really kind of love, mixed with anxiety and fear. And it becomes a way for us to manage our own anxiety, right? So constant, if only my son would do this, if only that. Um, those are those are attempts to try to manage, what's underneath all of that: fear, terror, helplessness, powerlessness, but our the illusion that we can be in control of certain circumstances, um, in a kind of way, can be comforting to us. It gives us kind of a perverse sense of control. Um, and with that focus on managing my anxiety, I start losing what's best for the person who's struggling. Because now it becomes about, I need you to change so that I can feel more comfortable in my own skin. And guess what? A young adult or a person with an addiction, or they can smell that. And they'll say things like, this is really about you. It's about both of you. But someone can begin to get an idea that this is less about me and more about you being able to feel safe again. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to feel safe, um, except when it's focused on changing another person or changing their behavior. So over functioning, if you look at it, if love is a strength, any strength can be underused or overused. So love without other strengths like clarity, temperance, boundaries can be overused and now begin to get in the way of a person's recovery, including your own. So this is what overfunctioning looks like. And I'm sure people on this call can relate to any of these. Constant checking, the repeated advice, over and over again, the same advice with their son or daughter just nodding, having heard it 10,000 times, and maybe agreeing to placate you to reduce your anxiety, but then they don't do anything with it. Right? Managing natural consequences. Um, we might call this rescuing. Um, Someone begins to get into some legal trouble or gets a DUI, and but makes a compelling case about why they need their car again. Or you start feeling badly because one of the roles we'll see that parents are sometimes forced into is the adversary. None of these are roles that as parents we thought, okay, when I become a parent, I want to assume one of these roles. This feels really good to me. We're moved into those roles in an effort to try to create stability and safety. So people can probably relate to some of these, right? And these are sort of the underlying assumptions under these roles. And these are just a few roles. I could list half a dozen more. They're along similar lines, right? The hypervigilant private investigator. If I can figure out what's going on, if I can monitor their phone use and track maybe I can prevent something bad from happening. Right? No one ever wanted to be in a role where you and your adult child or teenage have become adversaries. We're like, what happened to the kid that I just really wanted to love on? And now we're in this constant position of fighting. And these different roles, by the way, parents might find themselves moving among several of them. Or as we'll see, sometimes one parent will take on one role and another parent will take on its polar opposite. Right? So one parent might become the rescuer and the other parent becomes the adversary and becomes the bad mom, bad dad. So researchers have taken a look at communication patterns in families where there's chronic anxiety. And they've done this in looking at um, people with persistent mental illness, depression, addiction, other kinds of issues. And they notice that these communication patterns can emerge. And or people can alternate between them, right? So um, the frustration that your child isn't doing something, isn't moving forward, isn't doing what you want them to do or their treaters want them to do, right? We can become increasingly critical. And by the way, that can shift very easily into, well, I've been cheerleading you. I've been cheerleading you so much. Now I'm getting really frustrated that this isn't working. So it's very easy for me to then jump into being very critical or hostile. And again, what's underneath it? What's underneath it is fear, helplessness, powerlessness. And those are hard feelings to bear. I think tolerating helplessness is probably one of the most difficult emotional states for a parent to bear. And we'll do all sorts of things to try to demonstrate how much power we have that only gives us sort of temporary relief, right? So all the help, all the walking on eggshells, eventually that gets exhausting. And then you hear these kind of hostile comments. And many of them are legitimate. I've worked with families who've spent a small fortune
No,
on
I'm
their.
good.
Okay. Um, People, make sure you quiet your mics. Um, um, People spent small fortunes on getting their kids treatment. And when there's not kind of the return on investment, it's pretty easy to get resentful. I could be using my 401k on me. And then, the other one is this kind of emotional overinvolvement. And this can kind of look like infantilizing at times. So parents can move from infantilizing, babying, doing for their kids what they could be doing for themselves. And their in total emotional well-being is tied now to how their child is doing. Right? The parent in some way says, um, um, they only will do as well as how their kid is doing. And what a roller coaster that is. Right? I'm up when things are well. There's a relapse. Whew, that's a tough way to live. And often what's underneath that is, terror of loss. And I think one of the hardest things, and I think some families have to get there, um, is sometimes acknowledging um, the possibility that the son or daughter could die from substance abuse. That's a hard one to face. It doesn't mean you're resigned to it, or there's nothing I can do. That kind of resignation, sometimes it's important to recognize that, because often that's what's the terror underneath all of that emotional involvement. The idea of, I can't tolerate the idea of losing my child. So they've looked at kind of this um, ways that these emotional these expressed emotion can contribute to relapse. And again, I don't want anyone to think that this means these communications cause relapse. They can contribute to it, but ultimately, whether someone relapses or not is really the responsibility of the person with the substance. But it can create an environment um, where it's so reactive, no one really wants to be around each other. Or someone feels so criticized, right? And this is sometimes very difficult to do in family situations or with spouses. Um, I work with a man who every time he and his wife argue, the issue of his drinking is brought up to him. Now, he's been sober 10 years, but his spouse's feelings about all of this have not really been processed. So at times when she's feeling frustrated with him, what comes into her mind is the hell you put me through. And I want to remind you of it. By the way, the word resentment literally means to refeel. So a resentment is something we refeel over and over again. And that's why in the recovery world, for people in AA, they say when you have a resentment towards someone, that creates a risk for relapse because you're stewing, you're reliving this thing over and over again. But that constant criticism can actually lead to a lot of shame, right? And it's very appropriate in early recovery that people feel guilty and in some cases shame, depending on what they've done. That's an important part of the recovery process and facing that. But if it's repeatedly brought up to you, you could see where that would create an environment where you could say, okay, you keep expecting me to do this, I'll do it. Right. Or the over involvement, can just really lead to, you can call it under functioning, not having to assume responsibility for one's life. Because in some ways, I know it'll get taken care of. Because if I underfunction, mom or dad will get really anxious and they'll do it for me. They'll take care of it. Right? So these are kind of patterns of communication that can emerge as a result of this chronic anxiety that can create an environment that can contribute to relapse in lots of ways. So here's something we see. This is when families become polarized, right? And this, people may have had experience with this. Parents become, one becomes the adversary. I'm going to be the one who sets the law down. And the other one becomes softer, becomes more like the cheerleader. And in some ways, the cheerleader and the person with the addiction can make an alliance against the adversary. Your mother's really too rough on you, right? And so, we call that triangulation, which is another way that family systems manage anxiety, right? You can get grandparents and siblings taking different positions on this. So I worked with a family where the parents were trying to do the right things, be loving and set boundaries, but a set of grandparents was undermining it. And when I said families can become triangulated, essentially that's what I mean. Instead of uh, if there's a problem between person A and person B, you bring in person C. That's a triangle, right? So if I have an issue with my wife, and instead of talking with her about it, I take one of my children aside and I say, your mom is really getting to me. That's a triangle. And now I've just brought a kid into a situation that's really between me and my wife. Right? And all families do this, by the way, to varying degrees. But you could see where nothing ever really gets resolved because the two people who have an issue aren't really addressing it. The anxiety is reduced by bringing in a third. Right? So again, I don't think I'm saying anything that people probably haven't experienced here. Your marriage can become, your marriage isn't even about a marriage anymore. You're now you're both in crisis management. And people can lose contact with one another. Right? Having a family member or child with any serious or significant mental or physical health issue causes enormous strain on marriages. And then sometimes there are children who are not. This is where sometimes we talk about child roles, like a child can become the golden child. I'll become the perfect one, and I'll represent the family into the outside world. And I won't have any needs, and I can fall into that role. Right? That's the golden child role. Or sometimes we talk about kind of the lost child, the one who just sort of merges into the woodwork. Some things that are out there in the popular literature. And this is what it looks like. Fear. I'm afraid something bad's going to happen. I'm going to increase my surveillance, my monitoring. I'm going to find out that they're doing something they're not doing, they're supposed to be doing. I'm going to confront them. And there might be some kind of rescue, some temporary relief, and then the cycle goes round and round. Okay. So I'll give you the good news and the bad news. So the good news is that to break out of this is relatively simple. The bad news is very hard to do. As maybe some people who've been in the New Canaan Parent Support Group can attest to. Because you have to begin to focus on your own functioning. Maybe it doesn't sound accurate, but the more you're focused on the person with the addiction, the more you're in this kind of parental anxiety management. Your thinking isn't clear about what's best for their recovery. And people lose contact with themselves. I have a dear friend and colleague, Diana Clark, and she had an expression, how empty of me to be so full of you. Right? And I've seen parents lose their whole sense of self in caretaking. And you can imagine what someone then has to experience when they have to stop doing that role. Now they're feeling anxious. They're feeling like, well, I feel empty. This has been my role for, all these years. And now you're telling me I need to back off that. Right. It's about learning to stay connected without trying to just control the person with the addiction, their behavior. It doesn't mean you can't set boundaries. We'll talk a little bit about that. And caring without over functioning. Right. So these all sound simple. I know that. And I know it means doing our own work. Right. That's why when someone goes to an Al-Anon meeting, what they'll hear in an Al-Anon meeting is keep the focus on you. And sometimes people have been they've sacrificed themselves to such an extent they don't even know what that means anymore. So here are some of the ways this can transition, right? How the communication transition from criticism to making a very clear statement of what your concern is. Asking people to be accountable for their past actions is appropriate. It's an important part of recovery. Repeatedly reminding them of how bad they are isn't particularly helpful. And then this whole issue of boundaries. This is something I've talked about before with the New Canaan Parent Support Group. Boundaries are for us. Our boundaries teach other people how to be in relationship with us. Right? So let's say I'm good, I'm good friends with Eric T on the call, right? And Eric T, when we get together, talks to me in ways I don't like. And I say to Eric T, Eric, is it okay if I'm using you for this example?
Yeah, sure. That's
Okay.
fine, Frank. Thanks.
And I say to Eric, look, if you continue to talk to me this way, I'm not gonna spend time with you. That boundary isn't for Eric's benefit, it's for mine. Now, Eric might learn, oh, well, if I want to be his friend, I can't speak to him in certain ways. So boundaries are for us. It's not control other, because some people say, well, I'll set these boundaries and that'll create discomfort and that'll lead to them getting treatment. The metaphor I use about boundaries is there must be maybe some boat owners out there. Boats don't sink because of the water that's on the outside of the hull. Boats sink because of the water that gets inside. So setting a boundary is like going down into the hull and patching up the holes and leaks. Because the message is, I can't go down with you. I love you and I have reasons for living and I can't go down with you. Or I love you and I can't continue to see you destroy yourself. It's not good for me. That's a boundary.
I at the risk of jumping in, Frank, I
Yeah.
love that you used the word and after I love you and not the word but.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's I'm sure that was a purposeful distinction.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really what a boundary is. It's saying, you may not use drugs in my home. It's against my values. Not a big explanation. And then you got to come up with, and if they violate the boundary, then you have to think of, well, what will be the consequence? Right. So the boundary is, you may not use drugs in my home. They violate it. I want to remind you, if you use drugs in my home again, you're going to have to find somewhere else to live. That's the consequence. So again, you'll notice some of the and words are right. I love you and I have a right to my own life. I love you and I have a right to my own peace. I love you and I can't manage my whole life trying to manage your addiction. And that's really where you start getting into this thing about appreciating that we all have different paths. And that's hard to accept when we see someone going down a path that we don't agree with, or that is going to a word is going to lead to destruction. So people just heard me sort of setting boundaries. None of them involve name calling. None of them involve long, lengthy explanations about, why I'm doing this. If we repeatedly allow our boundaries to be violated, we're going to experience that as a threat and eventually respond in probably a pretty aggressive way. Because when we set a boundary and it's repeatedly violated, anger is an appropriate response to that. Right. So there's benefit in setting boundaries when things are still small. So these are old, if anyone goes to Al-Anon, you'll hear this. You didn't cause it, you can't control it, you can't cure it. So what you focus on is, what can I control? Well, I can control my own behavior. Right? If I can remain centered and in a state of something what we call wise-mindedness, I can influence the emotional climate of the home. But that really means taking responsibility for our own functioning within the family system. What tends to happen in family systems, just like in marriages, we point our finger at the other person and say, you change first. When you change, everything will be great. Right? And that's called an impasse, because their finger is pointing back at you, saying the same thing. Right? But if we look at whether it's a marriage or a family, that there's another entity, there's the relationship. Right? So when I do couples work, I say, I'll use a corny metaphor that, your marriage is like a garden, and you both have to be responsible for the maintenance of it. And if you point your finger and say, no, it's all them, it's just looking at how you may have contributed to the situation. It's not taking responsibility for things that aren't your responsibility. So the answer in some ways, as I said, seems fairly clear, but it's really hard to do because it also involves a lot of mourning, as probably some of these parents can attest to. We have to grieve the loss of the family maybe we imagined we would have. Or, your son or daughter doesn't go to prom because they're in treatment. That's what we call a disenfranchised loss. There's a loss in there. It's never imagined I never imagined it being this way. Or I've become such an adversary to my son. We've nearly come to blows. Never in my wildest dreams could I imagine being in that position. Right? There's grief. There's some grieving that has to be done. There's even grieving in accepting the limits of our control of our children. So that's the hard work of it. And it's doable because there are people on this call I know who've done it. I don't think they would say it was easy, but it was necessary. So again, I don't like that language sometimes about detachment. In recovery, what we mean we mean detaching from the outcomes, that we can't control outcomes. It doesn't mean detaching from your child and becoming indifferent to them. But it does mean loving with boundaries and loving yourself. It remains being an I and a we at the same time. Right. So in families, there's a lot of we-ness, right, which is important. That's the get togetherness part. But there's also a need to also have sense of myself, I. And when we lose ourselves, essentially what we've done is we've fused ourselves with the person with the addiction. It doesn't even feel like we're separate selves anymore. And focusing on, well, who am I if I'm not the caregiver? Or who am I if I'm not the rescuer? These are sort of new roles that I have to step into potentially. Um, and it's not easy to manage anxiety. One of the ways that we try to do that is by staying present to what is. So, you're in an anxious mindset when your mind is going, what if, what if, what if? You're thinking about possibilities. They may not be probable, or they may be, but it's not here yet. Right? They're negative predictions. That doesn't mean you can't cope ahead for something bad from happening. That's different than being hypervigilant. Right? So anxiety is about imagining a future, but your body is responding as if it's real and in the present happening. Right? And that's one of the things about the human brain where we can suffer so much, because we can imagine things in the future that haven't happened yet, but our bodies, these old brain systems, will react as if it's happening right now. Again, these roles that are often assumed in the state of chronic anxiety, it's not who you are. It's not an identity, right? And danger comes when we become so identified with a role that we think that's who it is. That's who we are, right? So um, I've worked with men who their whole identity was revolved around their professional self, and they didn't spend a lot of time developing other roles in their lives. Well, when those men retire, they feel like the hole in the center of the donut. They're like, who am I? What am I? Um, because there's initially there's a space there. Same thing can happen for a full-time parent, and their last child goes off. Well, this has been the role that has consumed most of my life, and now it's diminished. What do I do now? And sometimes when we're stepping into new roles, we need role models. So that's why there are people, the benefit of being involved in groups is you get to be with people who've been through that process, right? How did you do it? How did you get there? Because initially it might be, we don't know how to do that role. I can do the rescue role really well. So that's the other benefit of support groups and having people who are further along and can say, this is what worked for me. All right. These are just different transformations, right? So for private investigator, you can become an observer. Um, Crisis manager can become a self-manager, right? A lot of times we find ourselves giving advice that we're not taking ourselves, right? So, and a cheerleader can become a more realistic encourager. So these are the new roles that could emerge. So just to kind of conclude, um, some of the key things here is that small shifts in reactivity can create meaningful change in a family system. That's why if each person assumed responsibility for their own functioning, changes can happen in the family system. If I'm pointing my finger at Paul and say, Paul, when you change, things will be better around here. Well, I better not hold my breath. because Paul may not be up for changing. So, what I want to say to, particularly parents is, um, because in our culture, we can turn self-sacrifice into, we can elevate it to a noble act. And when we're focused on someone so that we can feel better, it's in some ways more about us. That's a hard one to say, but and it does not do. Um, if you neglect yourself, there are people in your life who are watching. And then you're going to say to them, I want you to take good care of yourself. And yet you've not modeled any of that. So I know we don't have much time, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I can't answer any, if you have specific situations about your family, I can't give clinical advice, but if there's some general questions, I'd be happy to opine on.
I got a quick one.
Yeah.
If, sometimes we look around and we see parents who seem like, their kids are doing great and everything's wonderful. And gosh, I could never get there. What's the first step I can take? I mean, sometimes it seems like such an insurmountable problem.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got great advice here, great things to do, but there are two things that stand in the way. One of the things is me and my own, I don't believe I can really do that. I don't believe I
Yep.
can do that really hard work that you're talking about. That's one
Right.
thing. And the other thing is, maybe it's my second question. What if I'm the only one in my marriage who's ready to do that and my spouse is not ready? Sorry, big questions.
Yeah. So the answer to the second question is you do it anyway, if it's for the family system. If it's purely marital work, sometimes you can't be in a healthy marriage if someone doesn't want to get healthy. Right. But that's where you, as the other individual, gets to decide how long do I want to continue with this. Right. So it's still focused on you. Right. So for your own and even then it's important to continue to focus on kind of your own self-regulation, your own clarity, right? So that if you do decide, um, I've been working very hard and, my spouse will not stop drinking, I get to decide how long I want to continue with that, right? Um, and your first question was about how enormous it can seem. And this is where I think some of the received wisdom from AA, when they talk about sometimes we have to break it down one day at a time. Sometimes it's 1 hour at a time to manage ourselves. And sometimes it's, again, in AA, there's also another expression, do the next right thing. What's the one small step I can take today? Right. For one parent, it might be, I'm not going to check my phone every 2 minutes. I'm going to try to go 15 minutes without checking my phone or checking whatever that 360 is, where they're located. Or I'm going to focus on managing my own anxiety. It's really like making, sometimes we ask people, make a circle and put in that circle everything that you can control. And on the outside of that circle, everything that's not within your control. So what's something in your control? For sometimes it's, I can slow the rate of my breathing. I can go for a walk. I can speak with someone who's been through this. Right, so sometimes it's broken into these very sort of small tasks, because you're right. If you look, it's sort of like what happens with people with addiction. They say to themselves, I can never drink again. That's almost impossible to manage. But if I say, I'm not going to drink today, that seems a little more manageable. And, my friend and colleague, Diana Clark, often talks about, for the one that's overly emotionally involved, she'll say, um, your son is addicted to drugs and you're addicted to controlling your son. It sounds harsh, but there are some similarities, right? Um, the child, the substance abuse person is looking for a substance outside of themselves to feel better. The parent is looking for something that they're outside of themselves to feel better, right? They both may have to accept this idea of powerlessness, right? So there's often parallels between that in terms of, um, one parent like this, and she's always giving her son advice to go to meetings. So I said to her, why don't you go to a meeting? Instead of telling him to go to AA meetings, why don't you go to an Al-Anon meeting? Right? You go, you do it. Oh, I never could do that. That'd be too difficult. And I'll say, well, maybe that's one of the reasons your son isn't going to meetings. We call it kind of parallel process. But again, um, I don't want any parent leaving here feeling like, feeling blamed. Again, this stuff emerges slowly out of love and loyalty and devotion. And sometimes we're in those roles without even being aware that we've stepped into those roles. Anyone else?
Well, Frank, I had one, just any books that you would recommend on this whole um, topic of family role play and Bowen and the Bowen systems, family system.
Yeah, there's a very small book. I think the author last name is Gilbert, called Extraordinary Relationships. And she takes Bowen family systems and puts it into very kind of easy to read language. That's a nice little book. Extraordinary Relationships by I think it's by a psychiatrist. The last name is Gilbert.
Okay, great. And are you willing to make the slides available for the parents? Or
Yeah.
okay, great. All right. Well, I hope others will join me in thanking Frank for the fourth time attending one of our pathway sessions and giving outstanding advice. Thank you, Frank.
Okay.